They were upper-class English schoolboys, groomed to become gentlemen.
I was banned from playing the guitar because it was a symbol of the revolution.
It wasn't the proper thing to do, but they became one of the world's biggest rock bands.
It was the most unlikely thing in the world for me ever even to pursue this career. It was never what I was supposed to do.
Lead singer Peter Gabriel put Genesis into the art rock spotlight.
I remember coming out in this fox's head and a red dress. And that was a great way to start a show.
It made Pete very much the focal point and the star, and so it is very much he rather than they.
Soon after Genesis gained stardom, their theatrical frontman made a dramatic exit.
One day we woke up and the front page of Melody Maker was Gabriel quits Genesis.
It was a bit like telling someone who decided to kill their child.
It was like Jagger leaving the Stones.
But Genesis discovered the perfect replacement was already in the band. With Phil Collins out front, Genesis rose from cult favorite to international pop phenomenon. But Phil took heat for the band's new musical direction.
Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins, you know, which Genesis do you prefer?
The old Genesis fans nightly stick pins in my effigy.
Then Phil Collins launched a solo career that upstaged the success of Genesis. Now, the story of a few well-bred English gentlemen who took a risk and rocked the world. Genesis, behind the music. In 1998, in a lounge at London's Heathrow Airport, everyone who had ever been a member of Genesis gathered for a brief reunion. The event was held to mark the release of a long-awaited box set from one of the most dominant and influential rock bands of the past 3 decades.
We got together for this photograph shoot and everybody was just, we had a great time.
Sorry about that. Former Genesis members and solo superstars Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins shared memories with former bandmates Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, Steve Hackett, and Anthony Phillips.
You know, you didn't get this feeling of a load of kind of posturing prima donnas all trying to sort of grab the sort of front spot. You've got world superstar Phil Collins standing alongside me, and I thought that was really, really good.
And we said, we should do this more often, you know, we should form a group.
Well, this is the trouble with getting ancient. Yes, there's a lot of history. And my usual response to how I view my past with Genesis is that it was a healthy part of growing up.
We used to fight a lot in the band, really. I mean, I think it's difficult for close friends to sometimes to be in the same band.
But we never had a single argument about money. We used to argue about music all day long.
When one singer left for a solo career, they found another. And when that singer also became a solo sensation, Genesis still survived. From their art rock early years to their power pop glory days, Genesis has always been able to reinvent itself and move on.
I never worried about, will this record be better than the next record, will this record sell more than the next record, because we've always done what we wanted to do.
This is the time. This is the place. So we're for the future.
The band's history together nearly spans a lifetime. From boyhood to adulthood, the strength of Genesis has been the friendships that formed it.
The childhood bond is between Tony and Peter. They're very close and always have been, still are.
Leaving all the world to play, they disappear.
Shy schoolboys Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks met in 1963 on their first day at one of England's elite boarding schools. The two privileged 13-year-olds attended Charterhouse, founded in 1611, an institution steeped in tradition, discipline, and strict academic standards.
It was a pretty horrible place, and at night time you'd hear sounds of boys either crying or masturbating, or a combination of both. And that was a sort of welcome to public school life.
Public school was reserved for the upper crust of English society, and Charterhouse ranked among England's most exclusive.
It was quite a stuffy public school for its period. You were very out of touch with the real world.
But just a quick train ride away in London, a musical revolution was brewing.
The Beatles were well established. It was before flower power, but I mean, London was definitely swinging. All you wanted to do was to be part of that youth culture of London, which was just so exciting.
By 1965, Anthony Phillips and Mike Rutherford had also entered Charterhouse. The two shared a passion for music and rebelling against the rules of the institution.
We definitely did feel incarcerated.
Actually, I was banned from playing the guitar most of the time I was there because it was a symbol of the revolution. Quite early on, we got into writing our own songs. And to be honest, I mean, I'd say that Ant was probably Anthony Phillips, the leading driving force at Charterhouse to get writing and stuff.
When Mike and Anthony planned to record a demo tape of their songs, Peter and Tony, who had also been writing songs and playing in a band together, volunteered to help.
I said to him, actually, why don't we come along? I'll come along and play keyboards on it. And Peter will come along and play drums. When Ant started singing his song, I thought, well, Peter's got a much better voice than that. Why don't you let Peter sing all the songs, you know?
Peter Gabriel stepped out from behind his drum kit to sing lead vocals.
Tell you the story of how my life ran.
The boys gave their demo to Jonathan King, a Charterhouse graduate with music industry experience.
I think he heard something on it. I think it was probably Peter's voice that he liked.
Hey, you started me going.
The four 16-year-old songwriters were still in school in January of '67 when Jonathan King signed them to a songwriting deal. King also came up with a name for the band.
His first choice actually was Gabriel's Angels, which I liked a little better than the others in the band.
Later that year, the boys were still at Charterhouse when they got signed to Decca Records.
You're in the hands of destiny.
And we were like sort of part-time school kids. You know, we hadn't really gone serious.
Genesis released their debut single, The Silent Sun, in February of 1968. Peter Gabriel was just 18 years old.
The silent sun that never shines. She is the warmth of my lonely heart.
But DJs didn't spin The Silent Sun. Undaunted, the boys spent their summer holiday in a recording studio and produced their first album.
The album was released to a blaze of obscurity.
Released in the spring of '69, From Genesis to Revelation sold little more than 600 copies.
And of course, the pound note signs weren't flashing.
In midsummer, Peter, Tony, Mike, and Anthony finished their final term at Charterhouse. For the four graduates, it was a defining moment. They could go on to college as everyone expected, or devote themselves to the band.
We somewhat foolishly decided to choose music.
Their parents were less than thrilled.
I'm sure they thought, oh my God, please, please give him a couple of years in a go out of it, you know.
Music was there as an option, and I knew it was a chance that would only come once.
It was a chance they almost missed. With sales of their first album non-existent, Genesis was soon dropped by Decca Records. Then in March of '70, less than a year after their graduation from Charterhouse, the band played a showcase gig for Charisma Records, where they were seen by President Tony Stratton Smith and Managing Director Gail Coulson.
There were 5 of them on stage and 6 of us in the audience.
Charisma Records signed the band, but guitarist Anthony Phillips was not feeling celebratory.
I suddenly started getting hit by stage fright. It was weird. I mean, and I was playing the chords and I suddenly thought, what the hell comes next? And my mind just went completely blank. I just couldn't think. And you sort of go onto autopilot, and I got through it, but it really scared me. It really scared me a lot.
His stage fright got worse as Genesis took to the road, but Phillips kept his anxiety a secret from the band.
Because it was so frightening, I finally really couldn't talk to the others about it. English people do bottle things terribly. Public school boys bottle things, believe you me. I became petrified of the same thing happening again. And this went on for months. Now, I never actually did lose it, but well, in the end, I physically cracked. I got bronchial pneumonia.
Anthony was bedridden, and after a few weeks off, he found he was out of sync with the rest of the band.
It just felt, I don't know, I think I'd sort of lost it, really. My heart had gone out of it, really. I wasn't going through the big terrors anymore, but I suppose the dream had gone somehow, in a way.
After 4 years playing with the group he once led, Anthony Phillips quit. His former schoolmates and band members were devastated.
It was, you know, like the Musketeers. I thought we couldn't lose one person.
And he was very important to the band in the early stages. I'd say he was almost the key member. And honestly, when he left, I thought we wouldn't carry on.
For the first time, Genesis would have to survive the loss of a leading member of the band. It would not be the last time. Next, Genesis drums in a new member.
Mike Rutherford walks in with carpet slippers and smoking jacket. And I thought, what planet have I landed on, you know?
And later, Peter Gabriel gives Genesis a new look.
I didn't know what to say, the audience didn't know what to do, but it kind of worked in a strange way.
When Behind the Music continues.
Is it really true what they're saying?
By the summer of 1970, the elite young men of Genesis had only been out of school for a year, but they had already lost fellow classmate and founding member Anthony Phillips.
Now I'm on my way, I am falling.
Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks began the search for a guitarist to replace Ant Phillips and a new drummer. Their want ad in London's Melody Maker magazine caught the eye of a 19-year-old drummer named Phil Collins.
I was looking through the adverts and I saw Tony Stratton Smith requires drummer sensitive to acoustic music and 12-string guitar player.
Collins had gone to drama school and worked as a child actor. He had been drumming for years in various London bands when he saw the ad. That day, Collins scheduled an audition at the home of Peter Gabriel's parents.
Pulled up outside this very, very nice country house and said, oh, this is all right, you know. And Mike Rutherford walks in with carpet slippers and a smoking jacket, you know, sort of dressing gown. And I thought, this is well, what planet have I landed on, you know?
Looking for someone.
As soon as he walked in and sat down, the members of Genesis knew Phil Collins was their man.
It's funny with the drummer, when they sit down in the kit before they even play, you get a sort of vibe off them, and he was fantastic.
I thought, this is the guy.
There was no doubt in my mind, or Peter's mind, that Phil was the man.
Trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Phil got the job and found himself keeping time and keeping the peace.
Every day someone would walk out in a huff. You know, there's a lot of tension around between Tony, Mike and Pete.
It was a nightmare. I remember having an argument with Pete and storming out and not coming back for a couple of hours.
We were quite intense young men, determined to prove the world how brilliant we were.
They were for public school, whereas I went to a drama school. I mean, and it was very free and easy in drama school. So I was miles away from that upbringing that they had.
A month after Collins joined the band, Genesis released their second album in October of 1970.
Stand up and fight, for you know we are right. We must strike at the lies that will spread like disease to harm.
Trespass soon followed their first album into obscurity, but it did help build a cult following for their live shows. That same December, Genesis found a permanent replacement for Anthony Phillips in 20-year-old guitarist Steve Hackett.
I thought they were great, but I thought there was room for improvement. So I guess I was as crazy as they were.
Genesis' classic lineup was in place, and the boys in the band took to the road.
It was great fun, and we just worked and worked and worked. We'd play in the north of England one day, and we'd play the south of England the next.
By 1971, Genesis had gained the attention of London's music community and their future manager, Tony Smith.
So I was initially struck by Peter, because he was extraordinary in the way he looked and the way he presented himself.
She's a lady, she is mine.
The band's set featured a number of complex story songs.
And let me
And shy frontman Peter Gabriel felt the pressure to communicate those stories to the audience.
We couldn't really afford all the fancy slideshows and projection stuff that some of the other bands were doing, but I could afford to dress up in funny outfits and shave my head in weird ways.
With the release of Foxtrot, Genesis finally cracked the UK album charts. And in the fall of '72, with their fourth album headed into the top 20, Gabriel took the band's live act closer to the edge.
We had this album cover for Foxtrot, which had a woman in a fox's head.
And he walked one day on stage in a red dress and a fox's head.
You could tell that the majority of the audience found it very disturbing. It was a great way to start a show.
Suddenly we had our pictures on the front of Melody Maker.
It was far easier to put a picture of him with the flower mask on the front cover of Melody Maker than to put a picture of the five of us who look pretty much like any other rock group.
Genesis suddenly found themselves on the British rock A-list. And by the summer of '73, Genesis had completed their first headlining tour of Great Britain and a full tour of America.
Hey, babe, your supper's waiting for you.
But offstage, the other band members were increasingly bothered by the focus on Peter's theatrics.
If you're the front man for a band, you get to be the main spokesman, and that tends to create quite a lot of resentments.
By the time the fifth Genesis album, Selling England by the Pound, hit the U.S. charts in the fall of '73, Peter was a star, and tensions were running high within the band.
Pete's show tended to get reviewed, and the band didn't really get a review. It was very much he rather than they.
He had some costumes he couldn't even get his microphone anywhere near his mouth. And you have to ask yourself if that wasn't perhaps going a little too far.
I started to get a little bit frustrated that the people were coming to see what Peter was doing rather than hearing the music.
Genesis went into the studio in early 1974 to record their next album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. But Peter Gabriel had a lot more than music on his mind.
My first daughter was born. They didn't think she was going to survive for a couple of weeks, so there was nowhere else that I wanted to be but with my wife and child. They registered this more as a lack of interest and involvement in the band, and that made me quite angry at the time.
We were unsympathetic. We hadn't had kids. Looking back, I think it must have been hard for him because his life changed and ours didn't.
First to have children, first to realise there was something more to life than just being in a rock band, you know.
But we were at that point where it's the band or it's not the band.
After 9 intense years of playing in a band with his boyhood friends, Peter Gabriel wanted out.
It's a bit like telling someone you decided to kill their child. You know, it's not a good feeling.
When you decided you wanted to leave, I tried to persuade him not to, definitely, because, for all sorts of reasons, really. One is he was my friend, and two, I also thought I didn't know whether the band could survive without him.
And now my ship is sinking, the captain stands alone.
Coming up, the drummer steps up to the mic.
There must be some misunderstanding.
I got the job because we couldn't find anybody else.
And later, he too threatens to quit the band.
So I said, now I'm going to go and move to Vancouver. So if we can exist as a band with me living there and you living here, that's okay, but otherwise, I'm out. I'm out.
When Behind the Music continues. After playing for nearly a decade in a band with his boarding school friends, 24-year-old Peter Gabriel was thinking of life beyond Genesis in the fall of 1974. After taking time off from the band to be with his newborn daughter and to work on a film project, Gabriel returned to tour with Genesis in support of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. the band's third top 10 album in the UK.
So Peter came back. Well, we welcomed him back, of course, but I mean, I think we knew at that point that anything could happen at any time.
That time came in the spring of '75.
I think it was like week one of the tour in America. Peter came to my room now and said he decided that really he wanted to move on and wanted to leave the band. And so my first question, facing a year of gigs in front of me, was, when did he want to leave?
I agreed then to carry on doing the touring cycle for the Lamb. But it was very strange knowing that I was going to leave and still be in the band.
The tour ended in France in May of '75. So too did Peter Gabriel's time with Genesis.
So suddenly we were at our last show with Peter. I think by the time you get to that stage where someone's going to leave, you kind of almost want it to be over so that you can get on with it, because, you know, you realise that things have to change and you might as well get on with change.
That I'd be the first one to go down.
The stunning news made headlines before the band could make a formal announcement.
One day we woke up and the front page of Melody Maker was Gabriel quits Genesis. Somehow the story had leaked. There would be obituaries in the music press, and people would sort of say, oh no, that's the end of that.
The band's future was not assured by any means.
The remaining members of Genesis were faced with a daunting dilemma.
We desperately wanted to carry on, but we knew how difficult it would be because he'd become the focus of the band, the front man.
We all really thought it was the end of the band. It was like Jagger leaving the Stones.
A lot of people thought, that's it, there won't be any more. He was Genesis.
The misconception at that time was that Peter wrote everything and the band just played the music and that was it.
Determined to keep Genesis alive, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Phil Collins, and Steve Hackett auditioned hundreds of new lead singers.
It was my job to teach these guys the tunes. I always did the harmonies, and so it was my job to teach these guys the melodies.
During the auditions, the band began to realize that the best new lead singer was already a member of the group.
Every time the guy would come down to the rehearsal room, Phil would sing the song, sort of like it's meant to be, and then the guy would sing it, auditioning, and they never sounded better than Phil. He always sounded better.
The guys were saying, well, you know, you sound better than the guys who are auditioning. And I was saying, well, that's as may be, but I'm the drummer. I don't want to be the singer, you know, this is where I live.
With the tracks for their next album nearly finished, Genesis held a final audition.
We had the last Hopeful down, and it didn't sound that great. And as he left, I said, can I have a go? Can I have a go? You know I could do better than this. You know, so I went down to the studio and I started singing the song, and everybody went, yeah, sounds great.
Gone with the towers you'd know from a child, along with the dream of a life.
Phil sang all the songs for A Trick of the Tail, but neither Collins nor his bandmates assumed he would be the permanent replacement.
We finished the record without a singer. I had just done the singing, but I was not the singer.
It was very difficult for us to visualise him as anything other than the drummer, you know, and he was also a background kind of guy. He was short. You know, he didn't look like the kind of guy you'd expect to see out the front of a group at all.
I got the job because we couldn't find anybody else, you know.
When A Trick of the Tail came out in the winter of '76, the enthusiasm of radio stations and record buyers made it triumphantly clear that Genesis would survive without Peter Gabriel. The album soared to number 3 on the UK album charts and nearly made the US top 30. Genesis launched a world tour in the spring with Phil Collins in the center spotlight.
The first show that I ever sang in was London, Ontario in Canada.
We go on stage and, oh, they're all going to go boo, but they loved it. The crowd loved it.
Because you'd come from inside the band, they didn't see it as sort of like an infiltrator. And he also was very good at it.
Angels never know it's time.
And probably, dare I say it, was in some ways a better singer on stage live than Peter. Don't let Peter hear that.
In some ways, he was a more natural singer than I was.
Die-hard Genesis fans were divided by Gabriel's exit from the band.
Some people sort of said, you know, you pushed him out, didn't you, because you wanted to do it. And I didn't want to be the singer. I would love to have stayed behind the drums.
And the Genesis story is really in two parts, you know, Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins.
I'm sure that the old Genesis fans nightly stick pins in my effigy.
Phil Collins did a brilliant job, and in fact the band took off to even greater commercial success.
Trick of the Tail sold more than all of the previous Genesis records combined. The band's success stirred mixed emotions in its most famous ex-member.
On the one hand, you're happy that the people you've known with since childhood did well, but my ego got twinged too, you know. So it went from a point, you know, when I was fronting the band, when everyone assumed that I did everything, to a point after I left the band and they got more successful, you know, and people assumed that I'd done nothing.
But by the fall of '77, Peter Gabriel had moved on to what would become an outstanding solo career.
Looks could kill, they probably will. In games without frontiers, war without tears.
At the same time, Genesis guitarist Steve Hackett was also thinking about leaving the band.
I felt this sense of being an outsider from the word go.
He was writing a lot of music and it wasn't getting on the records because there was just no room.
Steve felt that he wasn't getting enough of his ideas through, which is probably fair enough. You know, he probably wasn't, because, you know, I tended to shout a lot and get my ideas through.
2 years earlier, Hackett had laid down some of his musical ideas on his first solo album. And in the months that followed, Hackett became less and less interested in a future with Genesis.
I couldn't face the process of being able to paint part of the picture, but not the whole picture.
In November of '77, Genesis went into the studio to record their next album. Steve Hackett did not join them.
He never came in. He never came back.
I was worried that if I saw them, they would convince me to stay.
With Steve Hackett gone, the band was now a trio. For Genesis, attrition had become routine.
I don't think Steve leaving the band was as traumatic as Peter leaving the band, or even Anthony Phillips, you know, the original guitarist.
We'd sort of got used to it by then. We just lost Pete, you know, and I don't know, we seemed to have no problem going down to a three-piece, I have to say.
You know, originally we were 5 people full of ideas. In one band, no wonder you argued all the time. As a 3-piece, there was enough room, I think, for everybody.
In the spring of '78, Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks released the aptly titled And Then There Were Three. And 3 proved to be a magic number. On the strength of the hit single Follow You, Follow Me, the trio's album reached an appropriate number 3 in the UK, and by May it was their first gold album in America.
I think what we did with Follow You, Follow Me, of course, being a love song, it kind of doubled our audience, because suddenly there were girls in the audience, which there hadn't been before.
Genesis had come a long way from their early days as art rock cult favorites.
I don't know how many old Genesis fans there are of the early days, but, you know, a lot of it was, they've got a hit single now. Well, that's the end of that.
What has happened is you've gone from being a cult to a big cult to being kind of more mass appeal. And whenever that happens with any band, the original hardcore fans get pissed off because Genesis were their baby and they felt they'd lost something, I think.
Genesis launched World Tour '78 to support their newfound success. The tour continued for most of the year.
If we were going to really do this thing properly, we had to go to America and really play everywhere. And that meant time. And in fact, that's what caused my first marriage to break up, really. I was a musician. I figured that my partner would understand this. This needed to be done. Once you get over that hump, you're okay, you know? But, you know, it wasn't to be that way.
During the course of the tour, Phil's wife left him and moved to Vancouver, Canada to be with her family.
I said to Tony Mike and Tony Smith, I said, you know, my marriage is on the rocks, you know, and she's gone to Canada to be with her mum, and the kids have gone, and, you know, so I'm going to go and sort of sort it out, you know.
In a bid to save his marriage, Phil followed his wife to Canada. Before leaving, he made things clear to Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks.
I said, now I'm going to go and move to Vancouver. So if we can exist as a band with me living there and you living here, that's okay, but otherwise, I'm out. I'm out.
And I'm sure if we'd said, well, listen, man, it's the band or your missus, as happens sometimes in real life, he'd have said, well, to hell with you.
And they said, well, wait. You go ahead. You have a couple of months on your own, sort it out, and then we'll just get on with, we'll do our solo albums, won't we?
For the first time since they started playing together 13 years earlier, Genesis was taking a break. January of '79 saw Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks working on solo projects, while Phil Collins worked on his marriage. Genesis faced an uncertain future. Coming up, Phil Collins takes his solo career at face value.
Some people have said, you know, egotistical covers, because it's my face. And I say, how could you be egotistical with a face like this?
And Genesis cashes in on multi-platinum success.
I'd never kind of seen us like that, you know. I always saw us as a kind of like a slightly off-the-wall kind of group.
When Behind the Music continues. While Phil Collins spent much of 1979 trying to pick up the pieces of his broken marriage, his Genesis bandmates Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks focused on recording projects of their own.
Phil was taking time off to try and sort out his marriage.
I went over to Vancouver and I stayed there for a couple of months, and it was obvious that things weren't going to work out any better than they were before. So I came back.
His marriage over, 29-year-old Phil returned to England and his empty house. It was there that he began doing something he thought he'd never do.
I'd written bits, but never written songs. And suddenly, there was all this stuff that I kind of wanted to get out of me, I suppose. I can feel it coming in the air tonight. I didn't ever intended it to be a record. I just was writing songs and kind of, in a way, sort of stupid, childish way, just thought, I'm not very good with words, and so I'll just send her these songs, then she'll understand, you know? That was my feeling. That was what those songs were written for. They were messages. They were kind of letters. And I've been waiting for this moment for all my life.
When Genesis manager Tony Smith came by to visit, Phil played him home recordings of his new songs.
The last time we ever met. We said, these are great, you know, this could be a record. And I said, well, I can't face doing it all again. You know, I only just got it right this time. So he said, well, why don't you use these? And I said, I don't know if the quality's good enough.
Phil brought his homemade tapes to producer Hugh Padgham.
We listened to these songs and I just thought they were amazing.
Padgham agreed to help turn Phil's deeply personal tracks into an album.
We all knew what was going on and the angst and heartache.
Phil also played his songs for Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks.
I was sort of surprised. He always had this side to him which was sort of like his sort of James Taylor side.
I think I was probably jealous because he was able to write so much from the heart about his life and what was going on.
Mike and Tony picked two of Phil's songs for the upcoming Genesis album. When it was released in March of 1980, Duke went all the way to #1 in the UK.
It was about the time of Duke that we really started writing together as a group again. And for me, that's always been the most interesting part of Genesis.
Phil Collins' songwriting talents were widely celebrated when Face Value, the collection of Phil's open musical letters to his wife, was released in 1981.
Face Value was so personal. And the fact that it was done at home, I thought, this is really an insight into me, into my life. It was born out of this idea of it being a personal record, and so, you know, this is the guy, warts and all, this is what it is.
Phil's first album, solo album, Face Value, came out and just took off.
In the Air Tonight came out, and by 2 weeks it was on #2 in the charts, which was a bigger hit than we'd ever had, you know, as a group. So it was sort of a bit strange, really.
When In the Air Tonight hit the top 20 in America, Phil became a certified solo star.
I know I thought, well, maybe you want to carry on just doing that, nothing else, which would have been perfectly understandable.
Mike and Tony realised that here was not only a great singer and a great drummer, but a great writer too.
For the next 4 years, Phil kept up a successful solo career while collaborating with Mike and Tony on a series of top 10 Genesis albums. Some accuse the former public school art rockers of selling out.
If you get too popular, then yes, you're going to be seen to sell out. But selling out to me implies doing something which you don't believe in, you know, and you're compromising in certain ways. I never did that.
The people that had Genesis, the epic, in their mind, this was not what they wanted to hear.
In a highly successful musical balancing act, all 3 members of the band kept Genesis alive while continuing their solo pursuits. Rutherford's 1986 album, Mike and the Mechanics, went gold and spawned a top 10 U.S. single.
I'm always amazed more bands don't do what we did, which is to do different things and still run the group at the same time.
I think we had to do it. There's no way the group could have kept going without doing it.
Genesis becomes something that we can't possibly do on our own. It gives the band a reason to exist. So it actually strengthened the band in some respects.
Genesis showed their strength as a group in the summer of '86 with the release of Invisible Touch.
We had our first #1 album with Invisible Touch, first #1 single with Invisible Touch as Genesis.
Entering the UK charts at #1, the album went to #3 in America and sold over 5 million copies. By that fall, Genesis was playing the biggest stadiums in the world.
And I remember them doing 3 sold-out nights in Wembley Stadium. And you're talking 70 or 80,000 people a night. Well, I remember thinking, Jesus, this is big.
The band's Invisible Touch tour played through the summer of '87, after which Genesis took a well-earned break. Tony, Mike, and Phil devoted most of the following 4 years to solo projects before making their next Genesis record. But the 1991 album We Can't Dance would be Phil Collins' last with the band. On March 28, 1996, Phil Collins publicly announced his departure from Genesis. For Phil, Mike, and Tony, it was the end of more than a quarter-century of making music together.
Tony said, "It's a sad day." He said, "It's a sad day." Yeah, it's very sweet. He said, "It's a sad day. But we're going to carry on, but it's a very sad day."
Coming up, Genesis carries on without Phil Collins.
I'm not part of the story anymore. I'm part of the history, but I'm not part of the current story.
When Behind the Music continues. More than a decade after he replaced Peter Gabriel as lead singer of Genesis, Phil Collins left the band himself in 1996.
There's no point in trying to pretend.
Collins' exit left Genesis with just 2 original members. Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks had seen the band through all its changes and challenges, from its schoolboy origin to superstardom. Now, for the 3rd time in the band's history, Genesis was looking for a new lead singer.
By comparison with when Peter left, this is going to be a real Everest, because you're losing one of the biggest performers in the world from the band, and it's going to be very, very difficult.
But I don't think that's really true.
Genesis found a new voice with the addition of singer Ray Wilson, who sang the lead on the band's 1997 album, Calling All Stations. But with a less than receptive reaction from fans, Tony Banks wondered if it wasn't time to bring the final curtain down on Genesis.
I wrote a song a long time ago, a lyric to a song called Duchess, which is always one of my favourite Genesis songs, which was about a girl singer coming, her rise to fame and her fall down the other side. A very simple song. But I mean, I always saw it as a coded thing to do with the group itself, you know, that's why I looked at it. And I think we're somewhere sort of like pretty late on in verse 3 at the moment, and I think that's the time to, you know, I think maybe that's it.
And while the future of Genesis remains uncertain, former frontman Phil Collins' future is also less clear than in the days when he balanced solo stardom with his role in the band.
I'm trying now in my life to spend a lot of time doing nothing and waking up in the morning and say, what should I do today, as opposed to having something to do today.
But while all the former members of Genesis continue to work on their own projects, questions about the band's possible reunion still arise.
I think as far as Genesis are concerned, they have to look at what they've achieved up to now and say, well, what more is there left? What else can we do?
In 1999, the 5 members of the band's classic lineup re-recorded their 1974 song, The Carpet Crawlers, as part of a box set of Genesis hits. Having achieved superstar status as a solo artist, Gabriel welcomed the chance to work with his old friends again.
It's a bit like going back to school or just meeting your old friends in that way, in the sense that there's bits of history that you have there, and you know, you may have grown in a different direction, but you still enjoy revisiting once in a while.
The saddest part is we don't spend so much time together, and we had an awful lot of, well, fun. We used to laugh an awful lot on the road and making records.
I'd love to write together again, but maybe not call it Genesis, you know. I mean, we're grown-up men now. We can actually do things without it being a name, you know. We don't have to call it Genesis. We're just the 3 of us. We'll sit down and write because we like each other.
People always want to try and say, this guy's the main man, this guy's the main man. And I don't think it is in Genesis, really. I think it was the combination of all the people being in the same place that produced what was Genesis.
The schoolboys are now grown men, but they haven't grown apart. The bond of friendship that held Genesis together for more than 3 decades still endures.
Suddenly I got overwhelmed by the need to tell Mike that I loved him, you know. And I called him up from the car. I said, I just want to tell you that he was out, actually. I had to leave a message. I said, where's this Phil? I'm just ringing, really, just to say that I was thinking about you and tell you that I miss you and I love you, you know.
Get the real story behind Styx, next on the VH1 Arena Rock Marathon.